Raise your hand if you've ever scrolled past someone's pain and just thought, yeah, not my problem. Keep it raised if you've ever gate-kept an opportunity, just kept quiet about it because you didn't want someone else to get ahead. Now, if we were in a room together, almost every hand would be up right now. And here's the cold truth. That's not individualism. That's not freedom. The sources we're examining today diagnose this as the selfishness epidemic. And what's wild is that in almost every spiritual tradition that matters, they have a very specific word for this exact behavior: satanic. Let's get right into this explainer. The researchers and sociologists we're looking at argue that our modern culture actively, literally rewards this sociopathic behavior. We've been taught to treat life like our own personal Netflix series. You are the main character, and everyone else, well, they're just background extras, NPCs. Today, we're going to completely dismantle the mechanics of this cultural operating system, step by step, and we're going to look at the terrifying future these experts warn we are actively building. Part 1. The diagnosis: America's toxic triad. To really understand this diagnosis, researchers point to a massive, explosive collision of three things: the human ego, hyper-individualism, and late-staged capitalism. And at the absolute root of this triad is the ego. Now, in psychology, looking at people like Jean Twenge, who researches narcissism, and in ancient contemplative traditions, the ego is defined as this illusory, highly defended self. It's that incredibly fragile, totally insatiable I that constantly demands admiration and always externalizes blame. The texts argue that our culture has supercharged this into a literal pathology. It creates this toxic, zero-sum worldview where if someone else succeeds, your ego registers it as a personal failure. Okay, let's dive into this because the sources are very careful to point out that healthy individualism is not the enemy here. Healthy individualism gives us boundaries, drive, creativity, personal rights. But hyper-individualism, that takes those healthy traits and weaponizes them. It twists them into this me-first, society-be-damned mentality. Under this specific framework, needing other people, interdependence, is framed as a weakness. The research notes we're basically programmed to believe that relying on anyone means you failed, which turns our neighbors from a supportive community into straight-up competition. To put some hard, unflinching numbers to this, just look at Geert Hofstede's Global Cultural Dimensions data. The United States scores a staggering 91 out of 100 on individualism. 91. The research suggests we are culturally programmed, literally from birth, with main character syndrome. Get this, agreement with the statement, "I am an important person," was at about 12% among adolescents back in 1963. By the 1990s, it shot up to roughly 80%. The sources argue we spend our lives curating personal brands, turning existence into a performance where shared collective reality just completely takes a backseat. And this mindset, it's building into a very measurable, very dangerous crisis. Sarah Conrath ran these landmark meta-analyses at the University of Michigan, and the data shows a chilling 40% drop in empathy among U.S. college students since 1979. And the steepest part of that decline happened right after the year 2000. Both empathic concern, like actually feeling for other human beings, and perspective-taking have just completely collapsed. According to the sociologists, this is the empirical proof. Our cultural operating system is actively rewarding what is essentially a mild form of sociopathy. So what's the fallout? The sociological fallout is severe. Roughly 50% of U.S. adults now report feeling lonely either often or sometimes. And young adults are taking the hardest hit. And the physiological data is absolutely unambiguous here. Living with this level of isolation carries the exact same mortality risk as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Let that sink in. The texts note this incredibly dark irony. We were promised that ultimate independence would bring us ultimate freedom, and instead it has delivered an epidemic of lethal isolation. Which brings us to the third piece of this triad: late-stage capitalism. Economists in these texts argue that this specific economic engine perfectly exploits the ego and that hyperindividualism by selling us a massive myth, the meritocracy myth. The idea that the winners worked for it and the losers are just lazy. The sources note how perfectly this flatters the ego. It monetizes our deepest insecurities, and it actually frames gatekeeping as a twisted kind of virtue. Suddenly, hoarding resources isn't greedy, it's just protecting what you earned from everyone else. Part 2. The spiritual reckoning, the adversarial spirit. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how spiritual traditions across the globe, we're talking everything from esoteric texts to Christian mystics, impartially report on this exact same behavior. They consistently define this ultimate, unchecked selfishness as the very archetype of the adversarial or satanic spirit. These texts basically outline an adversarial playbook. They highlight 4 specific inversions of spiritual law, where love and interdependence are flipped completely upside down. The first inversion is do what thou wilt. In almost every major spiritual teaching, true freedom is defined as surrendering to a higher collective good or a divine truth. But the texts note that the adversarial inversion replaces that with pure self-worship. It takes my truth, my desires, my personal grind, and elevates that into a modern gospel. The sources liken this to pride in its purest form. It's the arrogant belief that any harm you do to others is just, acceptable collateral damage in your own personal plotline. The second is the inversion of love. Every major path teaches that the absolute core of existence is oneness and compassion, but the adversarial spirit, it glorifies separation. The authors argue that our culture has taken "I got mine, screw you" and made it mainstream. We've rebranded it as empowerment and setting boundaries. In contemplative circles, this collapse of empathy is viewed as a kind of dark magic. It's an act that literally feeds on human isolation and systematically hardens the human heart. The third inversion is materialism as idolatry. The texts argue that when you reject collective unity and put the ego on a throne, it creates a massive gaping void inside the human psyche. And late-stage capitalism steps right in to fill that void with endless consumption. We are essentially told to eat, buy, and wear things to become complete. It takes the exact same things that toppled ancient empires, greed, envy, pride, and turns them into the prime virtues of a successful modern citizen. And the fourth inversion is the normalization of harm. True adversarial doctrine celebrates the strong preying on the weak. The sources point out how modern hustle culture does this constantly, but weaves it away as just business. Punishing the poor, gatekeeping the weak, it's seen as a natural competitive right. The texts argue this perfectly mirrors the divider. It's the exact spirit that whispers, just look out for number one. These texts synthesize all these points into one heavy, unflinching warning. When a culture enthrones the ego and calls it freedom, it becomes a playground for the adversary. And the sources don't present this as some fringe theory. This is a consistent, historical warning repeated across centuries by mystics. When a society makes the self its absolute highest power, it becomes inverted, utterly selfish, and ultimately self-destructive. Part 3. The warnings. The inevitable collapse. And this brilliantly illustrates the path we are on right now. If we keep relying on hyper-individualism as our compass, the sociological and historical data points straight toward an inevitable breakdown. The researchers map out a pretty terrifying timeline here. In year 1, the hollowing of the soul. We are already seeing this with the massive loneliness and depression epidemics. By year 5, severe societal fracture and zero-sum polarization. Everyone at everyone else's throats. Fast forward 20 years, and the system literally devours itself through structural failure. And ultimately, looking 50 years out, the texts warn of total collective spiritual death. The ego's victory is the soul's defeat. The authors explain that this system is brutally difficult to break because it forms a perfect closed feedback loop. The ego constantly craves validation. Then, hyper-individualism steps in and normalizes the extreme isolation you need to relentlessly chase that validation. And sitting right there is late-stage capitalism, perfectly positioned to profit off your pain, selling you cures to the exact loneliness it created. Atomized consumers are left completely blaming themselves for what are actually intentional structural failures. Part 4. The antidote, ego surrender. So the crucial point is, what do? We don't need more self-help. The texts are abundantly clear that the only real way out of this horror movie is ego surrender, actively dismantling main character syndrome. They offer 3 highly actionable steps from the research to tear down this toxic triad. Step 1, completely refuse to gatekeep opportunities. Just stop doing it. Step 2, perform an act of anonymous service. Do something where your ego gets absolutely zero credit. And step 3, radically foster interdependence. Look someone in the eye, ask how you can help them, and actually mean it. The ultimate takeaway from these sociologists and all these spiritual texts is this: interdependence is not weakness. It is the absolute only way we survive. The culture of the hyper-individual has left millions of us incredibly isolated, sick, and anxious. So the challenge posed by all these sources is brutally simple. Are we going to keep feeding this main character ego, letting the system eat us alive? Or are we going to choose the radical, deeply human act of connection? The choice is entirely ours. So, what's it going to be?